The attorney's office smelled like old books and furniture polish, the same way it had for the 32 years I'd known Gerald Hutchins. I sat in the leather chair closest to the window, the one Margaret always chose whenever we came here together, and I let my son do most of the talking. Derek had a lot to say that afternoon. He stood near the mahogany desk with his arms crossed, wearing the suit he'd bought specifically for the occasion, and he talked about logistics, about timelines, about how the transition would be smoother for everyone involved if I didn't drag things out. His wife, Rachel, sat beside him with her hands folded in her lap and a small, careful smile on her face, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes because the eyes are busy calculating. I watched Gerald's face while Derek spoke. Gerald was 71 years old and had been a probate attorney for 4 decades. He had seen everything. His expression did not change, but I noticed the way he set his pen down very slowly on the desk, the way a man does when he has decided he no longer needs to take notes. "Derek," Gerald said, when my son finally paused for breath, "before we continue, I want to make sure you've read the full document. Not the summary, the full document." Derek waved his hand. "We've been through it. The business transfers, the property, the accounts. We understand." Gerald looked at me then, just for a moment. I gave him nothing back, just a slight nod, and he returned his attention to my son. "All right," Gerald said. "Then let's proceed. I should tell you about Margaret first, because none of this makes sense without her. We met in 1981 at a diner in Clarksville, Tennessee, where she was waitressing her way through nursing school, and I was a 23-year-old just out of the Army with $200, a duffel bag, and absolutely no plan. She brought me coffee without me asking. I took that as a sign from God, and I was right. We built everything together. When I started Callaway & Sons Construction, and yes, I used sons before we even had children, because Margaret said it sounded more established, she handled the books from our kitchen table while 8 months pregnant with Derek. She worked the phones, negotiated with suppliers, tracked every invoice and every payment. She was the reason the business survived its first 3 years. I was the one pouring concrete and managing crews. She was the one who made sure there was money in the account to make payroll. By the time Derek was in high school, the business was worth something real. By the time he graduated college, it was worth considerably more than something real. We had a good life. A large house on 12 acres outside of Danville, Virginia, the kind of property that doesn't come available often in that part of the state. A pond. A barn we'd converted into a workshop. 3 guest bedrooms that were full every Thanksgiving for 20 years. Derek grew up in all of that and somehow concluded it had always been there, like gravity or weather, something that simply existed, requiring nothing. Margaret saw it before I did. Mothers usually do. "He doesn't understand what things cost," she told me once, after Derek called asking for money to cover what he described as a temporary cash flow problem at the small landscaping company he'd started and subsequently run into the ground. It was the 3rd temporary problem in 2 years. Not in dollars, in everything else. I told her she was being hard on him. She gave me the look she reserved for when I was being deliberately naive. Margaret was diagnosed with ovarian cancer 11 months before she died. She spent the first 2 months after the diagnosis quietly and methodically putting her affairs in order, which was so completely like her that it broke my heart every time I walked into the room and found her at the desk. She consulted with Gerald for hours over multiple visits. She updated documents I didn't know existed. She made decisions she didn't discuss with me until she was certain, because she knew I would argue, and she didn't have the energy for arguments that weren't going to change the outcome. 3 weeks before she died, she told me what she'd done. I listened to all of it. When she finished, I took her hand and I said, "You think of everything." She said, "I think of you." That was Margaret. The reading of the will happened on a Thursday in March, 6 weeks after the funeral. Gerald went through the standard portions, first personal items, the accounts Margaret had in her name alone, the charitable bequests she'd arranged for her church and for the nursing school at Radford University where she'd finished her degree years after Derek was born. Then he came to the main estate, the business, Callaway & Sons, now worth approximately $4.2 million, according to the most recent valuation. The property in Danville, the investment accounts. Margaret had placed everything into the Callaway family trust. Derek leaned forward in his chair. Gerald explained the structure. The trust named Derek as the primary beneficiary. Upon my death, or upon my voluntary decision to exit the trust, full control would transfer to Derek without condition. Until that time, I served as trustee, meaning I managed the assets, made decisions about the business, and maintained the right to reside in the family home for the remainder of my life. Derek asked how long that arrangement was expected to last. I was 64 years old. His mother had died at 61. I understood the math he was doing. Gerald said that was not a question he could answer. Rachel, who had been quiet throughout, asked whether the trustee position could be transferred voluntarily, whether I could step down and hand Derek control sooner if I chose to. Gerald said yes, that was possible, and that the document provided a process for that. What Gerald did not say in that moment, and what Derek and Rachel did not ask about, was the rest of it. The part that came after. The conditions. The clause on page 11 that Margaret had spent 2 full appointments with Gerald refining until every word was exactly what she meant. I had read page 11 many times. I knew it by memory. Derek and Rachel had clearly stopped at page 8. The conversation at the house happened the following Saturday. I was in the workshop when Derek came in. He didn't knock, which was how I knew the conversation was going to go the way it went. A man who intends to ask something knocks. A man who has already decided does not bother. He sat on the stool near my workbench and told me he'd been thinking. He said the arrangement Gerald had described was inefficient. He said that at 64, I deserved to rest, not to be burdened with managing a company. He said there were options. A nice retirement community had opened up 40 minutes away, or if I preferred, he and Rachel had talked about converting the barn apartment into something more comfortable for me while they moved into the main house. The barn apartment was 400 square feet and had a space heater that rattled. I asked him which of those options he was genuinely offering and which one he was listing to make the first one seem reasonable by comparison. He said he didn't appreciate my tone. I put down the piece of wood I'd been sanding and looked at my son. He was 41 years old. He had his mother's cheekbones and my stubbornness, and somehow, despite inheriting the best of both of us, had become a man who drove 2 hours to attend the reading of his mother's will and wore a new suit to do it. I told him I needed some time to think about everything. He said he understood, and that he hoped I wouldn't take too long. He left without going through the main house to get a glass of water or check on the dog or do any of the dozen things a person does when they're in a home they feel belongs to them. He walked straight to his car. I watched his taillights disappear down the gravel drive and thought about Margaret at the desk, working through her papers in the lamplight, making sure everything was where it needed to be. The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday. It was from a property management company Derek had apparently engaged, informing me that a representative would be coming to assess the property on the following Friday and asking me to ensure that my personal belongings were accessible for inventory purposes. I sat at the kitchen table and read it twice. Then I called Gerald. Gerald said, "Harold, what would you like me to do?" I said, "Nothing yet. Let it run." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're sure?" I said I was sure. I called my younger brother, Roy, who lived 40 minutes away in Chatham and had a spare bedroom and no objection whatsoever to my company. Roy had retired from the Postal Service the previous year and spent most of his time fishing and watching baseball. He said to come whenever I was ready and bring the dog. I packed 2 bags, put Hank the dog, a 12-year-old beagle with a bad hip and impeccable character in the back seat, and drove to Roy's on a Thursday. I left a message on Derek's phone telling him I was staying with Roy for a while and that he should direct any questions to Gerald. I want to be very clear about something, because it matters to what comes next. I was not destitute. I was not eating canned soup by candlelight or wondering how to make rent. Margaret and I had kept separate personal accounts our entire marriage, not out of distrust, but out of a habit we developed early on when the business cash flow was unpredictable, and we wanted to know that household money was always separate from operating money. My personal account held enough to live comfortably for years. I had my pension from the Army, small but consistent. I had no mortgage, no debt. I left because I wanted to see what my son would do when no one was watching him. What my son did was move in. Within 3 weeks, Derek and Rachel had relocated to the Danville property. Rachel posted photographs on her social media. I know because Roy's daughter showed me of the kitchen she was planning to renovate and the master bedroom she'd already redecorated. She referred to it as our forever home in the caption. The business was different. Derek could not touch the business. He was not the trustee. He could not access the operating accounts, could not make personnel decisions, could not sign contracts. I had arranged with the company's operations manager, a man named Phil Tanner who had worked for Callaway & Sons for 18 years, to continue day-to-day operations under my remote direction. Derek called Phil. Phil, who had watched this family for nearly 2 decades, was politely unhelpful. Derek called me. I answered most of his calls. They followed a pattern. He would begin with some version of a reasonable question about the business, and when I answered it, he would transition to asking when I was planning to formally step down as trustee. I would tell him I hadn't decided. He would suggest I was being unreasonable. I would thank him for calling. This went on for 41 days. On the 42nd day, Gerald called me. He said, "Harold, it's time." I said, "What happened?" Gerald told me that Rachel had contacted his office the previous afternoon requesting a copy of the trust document, not the summary Gerald had provided at the reading. The full document. I closed my eyes. I thought about Margaret, spending weeks on page 11. I said, "When do you think they'll call?" Gerald said, "By Friday." It was Wednesday. They called Thursday morning. It was Derek's number but Rachel's voice. I could hear that she'd been crying, or was trying very hard to sound like she had been, which with Rachel was sometimes the same thing. She said there had been a misunderstanding. She said that she and Derek had not fully understood the scope of the trust document when she described it as, made some decisions about the living arrangements and that they wanted to discuss things with me as a family. I asked her to put Derek on. Derek got on the phone. He did not sound like someone who had been crying. He sounded like someone who had not slept. He said, "Dad, I need you to explain what this clause means. The one on page 11. I said, "You should have Gerald explain it. He drafted it." Derek said he had already spoken to Gerald and that Gerald had told him he needed to speak to me. Gerald had not, in fact, told him that. Gerald had explained the clause with complete clarity. But Gerald was a good man and understood that there are conversations that need to happen between fathers and sons, and he had directed Derek accordingly. I told Derek I would drive down on Saturday. I told him to make sure he'd read the rest of the document by then, not just page 11, because the clause on page 11 had to be understood in context. He said, "Dad, please, just tell me now. Does it mean what I think it means?" I said, "It means exactly what it says." I want to tell you what page 11 said, because I think it's important to understand how Margaret thought. She did not write the clause out of anger. I know that because I know who she was. She wrote it out of clarity. She had looked at her son, her only child, the boy she had nursed through ear infections and coached through algebra and watched graduate and tried, for 41 years, to teach the things that matter, and she had understood something about him that I had taken longer to accept. Derek was not a bad person. He was a person who had never been required to reckon with consequences, and the most loving thing she could do, in the last months of her life, was build a consequence into the architecture of what she left behind. Page 11 stated the following. In the careful language Gerald used when he wanted there to be absolutely no ambiguity, in the event that the surviving trustee, Harold James Callaway, is displaced from the primary residence at 4,412 Blue Ridge Road, Danville, Virginia, either by formal legal action or by circumstances created or encouraged by the primary beneficiary, Derek Allen Callaway, within a period of 36 months following the date of the grantor's death, the entirety of the trust assets, including the business, the real property, and all associated accounts, shall transfer immediately and irrevocably to the Callaway Veterans Foundation, a 501c3 organization established by the grantor for the purpose of providing housing assistance to veterans in Pittsylvania County. The foundation already existed. Margaret had incorporated it 6 months before she died. She had funded it with a separate personal account. It had a board of directors, a mission statement, and a registered office. It was ready to receive $4.2 million the moment Derek made the wrong choice. He had made the wrong choice on day 42, when he sent the property management company's letter and then took up residence in the house without my consent, creating the conditions the clause described. He had 36 months from Margaret's death. He had used 42 days. Saturday was gray and cold, the kind of March day in Virginia that can't decide whether it's still winter or just pretending to be spring. I drove down from Roy's with Hank in the back seat, and I turned onto Blue Ridge Road and felt, as I always felt driving that road, the specific ache of knowing that every mile marker and fence post on this stretch of highway was familiar to me in the way that only time and love can make a place familiar. Derek was waiting on the porch. He looked like he'd aged in the 6 weeks since I'd last seen him in person, which I noted without satisfaction. I did not want him to suffer. I wanted him to understand. Those are different things, and it took me a long time in my life to learn the difference. Rachel did not come to the door. I would learn later that she had gone to her sister's for the weekend, which told me everything I needed to know about whose idea the letter had originally been. I sat down in the chair on the porch, my chair, the wooden rocker I'd built from a kit this summer. Derek turned 12 and we'd worked on it together in the workshop, and I let Hank settle at my feet and I waited for my son to speak. He sat on the porch steps with his elbows on his knees, looking out at the yard. He said, "I didn't know, Dad." I said, "I know you didn't." He said, "Why didn't you tell me? At the reading. Or after, why didn't you just show me the whole thing?" It was a fair question. I had thought about how to answer it for 6 weeks. I said, "Because your mother needed you to find it yourself. That was the whole point." He was quiet for a long time. A crow landed on the fence post at the edge of the yard and sat there, untroubled. Derek said, "The foundation, the veterans' housing thing. She actually built it." I said, "She built it in October. She spent 3 Tuesdays in Gerald's office getting it right." He put his face in his hands, not to cry, I think, just to have somewhere to put it. I waited. After a while, he said, "She knew I was going to do this." I said, "She knew you might. She hoped you wouldn't, but she prepared for it anyway. That was your mother. She hoped for the best, and she planned for what was real." He looked up at me then, and I saw something in his face I had not seen in a long time. Not since he was a boy, maybe. Some layer of the adult performance peeled back and just my kid underneath, confused and tired and trying to figure out where the solid ground was. He said, "What happens now?" I said, "That depends on you." What happened next was not simple or fast, because real things rarely are. Derek had a difficult conversation with Rachel that I was not present for and will not characterize, because that is their marriage and not my story to tell. There were several weeks of lawyers and paperwork to establish that the actions taken had not yet crossed the specific threshold. The clause described, Gerald had been precise about that 36-month window for a reason, and that with my written consent, confirmed to Gerald directly, the trust could continue under its original terms. I moved back into the house in late April, not because Derek asked me to, but because it was my home and I had never actually left it, not in the way that mattered. Derek came to see me on a Sunday in May, without Rachel, without a suit, wearing the old flannel shirt he used to wear in high school that I didn't know he still owned. He knocked on the workshop door. He stood in the doorway and watched me work for a while, without saying anything. Then he said, "Can I help?" I handed him a piece of sandpaper. He sat on the stool his mother used to sit on when she came to keep me company while I worked, and he sanded the edge of the cabinet door I was finishing, and we were quiet together for about an hour. At some point, he said, "Phil told me the Henderson contract came through." I said, "Signed it last week. Biggest single contract we've had in 6 years." He said, "Mom would have been proud." I said, "Yes, she would." I did not say, "She's the reason we still have it to be proud of." I didn't need to. I think we both understood. I want to say something to anybody watching this who has children, or who is someone's child, which covers most of us. Money is not neutral. It does things to people, and the things it does are not always the person's fault, but they are always the person's responsibility. Margaret and I made a mistake, and it was not a small one. We gave Derek a life in which the distance between wanting something and having it was always very short, and we told ourselves that was love. It felt like love. I believe it was love. But it was love that skipped a step. The step where a person learns what things cost. Not in dollars, in years, in choices, in what you carry when you decide to build something instead of inheriting it. Your children do not need you to remove every obstacle. They need you to let them develop the muscles that obstacles build. Margaret understood that too late to do it the usual way. So she did it the only way she had left, which was to put the consequence inside the inheritance itself. I am not a wise man. I have made mistakes with my son that I will spend the rest of my life accounting for, but I know this much. The most important things I ever built, I built with these hands, and the sweat was not incidental to the value of what came out of it. The sweat was the whole point. Margaret knew that. She built a company with me from a kitchen table. She built a family. She built a legal document, at the end of her life, with whatever strength she had left, because she loved her son and her husband and she was not going to leave without doing everything she could to make sure we'd be all right. She was always the best of us. She still is. Derek asked me recently whether I was ever angry, during those 42 days, or in the lead-up to them, or when I got the letter from the property management company, whether I ever thought about calling him and confronting him directly instead of driving to Roy's and letting things play out. I said yes. Of course I was angry. I'm his father, not a saint. He asked what stopped me. I said, "Your mother." He waited. I said, "She didn't write page 11 so I could be right. She wrote it so you could be better. Those are different things. And if I'd called you and confronted you and made it about my anger, we'd have had a fight and dug in and nothing would have changed. She gave us a better ending than that. I wasn't going to waste it." He nodded slowly. He said, "I'm sorry, Dad, for the letter, for all of it." I said, "I know you are." I said, "Now sand that other edge. It's not even." He picked up the sandpaper and went back to work, and through the workshop window I could see the pond catching the afternoon light, and the fence line, and the gravel drive where I'd watched his taillights disappear 2 months before, and where his truck now sat in the yard like it belonged there, like he'd figured out that belonging somewhere is not something you receive, it's something you choose, again and again, with your actions, every day. Margaret built that into a legal document. I think she built it right.